Welcome to episode 38 of the Yoga Meets Movement Science podcast. On this episode, we will be discussing the very interesting question of whether we should always listen to our body. And this is a common recommendation in many contexts, not the least of which being yoga, where we are told to always listen to our body. But Jenni and I will be discussing, questioning whether this is actually always good advice or whether it turns out that sometimes maybe we shouldn't listen to our body. Or at the very least, maybe this is a more complicated topic than we sometimes make it out to be. And no discussion of listening to one's body or not would be complete without a review of the phenomenon of interoception, which we will define early on in the episode. So, our plan for this episode is to talk about this topic in a few different contexts. So, first, or maybe one of which will be yoga and mindfulness practices. Then we'll also talk about it in painful conditions or rehabilitation, as well as athletic performance and recovery. So, just a disclaimer here that we are not experts or authorities in when you should listen to your body or not, because everyone is their own expert in their own body and their own experience. But this is just a general questioning of the topic. Also, this is not medical advice, as always, but we are going to review some interesting research on this topic of whether to listen to your body and when to listen to your body and what it's telling you, what our feelings of what we're feeling in our body means, and just generally questioning some of those conventional beliefs. Before we dive in, just a reminder about some ways that you can support us and our work with this podcast. You can become a supporter of the podcast for just $3 a month, and the link for that will be in the show notes. You can also subscribe to our podcast and leave us a rating or a review. You can sign up for Jenni's newsletter to stay in the loop on everything we have going on. And the link for that is jennirawlings.com/newsletter. Again, that'll be in the show notes. And last but certainly not least, you can join us for our flagship Strength for Yoga remote group training program, which is our monthly strength training program for yogis. You can use the discount code podcast30 for 30% off your first month. And again, all of those links are in the show notes. So Jenni, thank you so much for joining me for this discussion.
You're so welcome. I'm super happy to be here.
Happy to be here with you as well.
Thank you for such a fantastic intro. And I think that you outlined what we're going to be addressing or what we're hoping to address today really well. I mean, I feel like the advice to always listen to your body, like just listen to your body. It'll tell you what you need to do. Just listen to your body. It will keep you on the optimal path or whatever like your perceived outcome is. But I feel like it's just kind of taken for granted and very widely out there that that's what we should always be doing. And
It does seem like good advice, right? Like if you had two diametrically opposed things where one person was saying, listen to your body, and then the other person was saying, never listen to your body, it's always wrong.
totally.
Maybe you would err on the side, but of course, it's not that black and white. Like you should always listen to your body, you should never listen to your body. I think that's what we're going to get into.
Yeah, it's not should we always listen to our body or should we never listen to our body? But
Right.
it's probably the case that if we're hearing one of those refrains, it's probably not a complete picture. Especially when it comes to like science, right?
Right. Yeah. Very
Which
few absolutes.
exactly. And so that's why it's like exciting to kind of tune into the actual scientific research on something like listening to your body, because we do get to dive in and see that there's just a lot more there.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't really talk about listening to your body in much depth without understanding the topic of interoception.
Yes.
And you
Which
might,
we've talked
yes,
about before, right? Do you know the
exactly.
number of the episode? I don't, but
Episode
sometimes you do.
24, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, episode 24.
You're amazing. Your ability to
I've got it all logged.
recount.
No, not
Yeah,
really all of them, but that
a
one
lot of
stands out
them.
in my mind because that
That was a
the
good one.
whole episode, yeah. We talked about a lot of excellent stuff on that episode.
So
What
we
was
can
it
refer
like?
people to that for a more in-depth discussion,
100%.
but we'll review now what you need to know for then the rest of this talk.
Exactly, exactly. And also because even if you have listened to that episode, it's still it's just such a meaty and fascinating topic that I think no matter what, like even just reviewing some of this content just helps it like solidify a little more. It helps us digest it more. I know that always is the case for me.
For sure. Yeah, it never hurts to hear something twice.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, when we're talking about listening to our body, you had said earlier, the scientific term for that really is interoception. And I'm sure many of our listeners are familiar with or have heard that term interoception before, but just to give us like a just a kind of summary definition, it's your awareness of the internal state of your body, basically.
Hmm.
It's like your ability to like sense inside yourself. You know, we've got the outer world, like the external world, and we have our inner worlds. And in some sources, you'll see like our sense of the outer world called exteroception, and then our sense of inside interoception. Although we also are kind of learning from research that the lines between those are a little more blurred than we may
Hmm.
always realize. But you can kind of loosely think about that as like two sides of like how we perceive our world, basically our body in the world.
What about just as we're defining these terms,
Yeah.
proprioception? Because when I learned interoception, I think I maybe I'd seen it before, but I really learned it more from you. And like prior to that, I was just like, well, that sounds kind of like proprioception. So
That's
what's the
such a good
difference there?
question.
Because they
Yes.
sometimes are lumped together.
Yeah, so proprioception is like your sense of your body position in space, basically. And it's proprioception is informed by like sensory receptors, mostly in your joints and your muscles. It's kind of informing your nervous system, how your body is positioned and arranged in space. And traditionally, dating back to something like 1904, in a really early work by Sherrington, he originally proposed like these three facets of the way that we sense our body: interoception, exteroception, which we've already gone over, and proprioception as a third. So a lot of people have kind of learned about those three. But
Hmm.
these days, with our understanding of interoception, like the research on interoception too, we should also point out, is totally evolving, and there's a ton that's not known. So that's also
Hmm.
why it's like extra exciting. But these days, the definition of interoception is much expanded, and it actually includes proprioception these days.
Mm.
So it's just kind of
So
like a
it's more of
subset.
like the umbrella, yeah.
Yeah, interoception is like the umbrella. Yeah. Yeah, so interoception includes proprioception. It's like your sense of how your body is positioned in space. It also includes like your sense of your viscera, so your internal organs. It's
Hmm.
also like tactile, like touch. And from what I understand, it's more like kind of light touch to the skin when talking about touch. That's technically interoception. So, like kind of lighter tactile touch. Also, thermal. So, like temperature, like when you feel warm, when you feel cold, that's interoception. And then pain is interoception, and emotions are interoception. So, it's really just a lot about the way that we experience our body in the world. Isn't that super cool? It's like a broad
Yeah, it's like
category.
what isn't interoception? But I remember my
Yeah.
like my take home from the interoception episode was kind of like if you can understand interoception, it really covers a lot of bases. Like you can, like you just said, you can understand pain and you can understand
Yes.
emotion because this is like this is the overarching phenomenon.
Exactly. And really, I remember like when I first started learning about pain science, that was kind of my first clue into the fact that listening to your body may not always be as straightforward as we think it is. And pain science, I think,
Hmm.
is a really good example to show us that.
Right.
And that's kind of why later, when I started learning more about interoception science, and I realized what a big overarching broad category that was. And pain science fits in so perfectly because it's just, interoception is like the umbrella above it. That's partly
Hmm.
why a lot of the interoception science made sense to me because I already had like learned about pain science.
Yeah. Isn't that cool? Like sometimes you you study something and then you study something after, and it's like, oh, I already know this because,
Mm-hmm.
but I didn't know that I knew this because it just wasn't introduced as, oh, pain science fits
Yeah.
nicely into this larger umbrella.
Right. But like what is pain ultimately? I mean, I know it has many definitions, but
People argue about that
that's like a big,
all
yeah,
the
I know
time.
that's a huge, like, what is pain? But like one way we could think about pain is that it's some sort of perception or feeling in your body that you feel that you then label as pain, you
Hmm.
know? It's a feeling in your body that we probably have learned through like our culture and our society. We've
Yeah.
learned like when you feel something that kind of, qualifies like that or has qualities like that, then that's pain. And you kind of learn like what that is and then we put that label on it.
Yeah.
And that's also the same with emotions. Like emotions are also literal feeling. Like we talk about them as feelings, but I think until I learned about interoception, I used to just think of feelings being more in my head, like more that's mental feelings, but they're
Mm.
really truly like anchored. They're literally feelings that you feel in your body. They're like perceptions. And we learn through culture and society, like which different feelings, might be correlated with different states. And we learn to label them with different names like happiness, sadness, very simplified terms. But so emotions
Hmm.
and pain, like in their nature, they're feelings that we feel in our body that we label as something. Like we have given this category that has meaning for us. And
Hmm.
that's how they're similar, like emotions and pain. And also stress is another example. That's a literal feeling. We all know the feeling of feeling stressed, but it's
Hmm.
also a feeling in the body that we label as stress because we learned like this name for it. I think that's like
Mm.
super cool. Yeah. And if you think about interoception as being made up of kind of all that stuff that I mentioned, like your sense of your viscera, just so much going on inside of you.
Hmm.
The truth is, we're really not wired, and it wouldn't make sense to be wired to really feel all of that stuff happening. And we're talking, like your cardio, like the blood running through your blood vessels, your
Yeah.
hormones being secreted into your bloodstream, food being digested, like just everything happening all at
That
once.
would be a lot.
If we actually sensed and felt all of that, like all of it, it would be overwhelming and we probably couldn't function. So what happens instead is that interoception just kind of gets lumped together into this like aggregate feeling that's presented for us to feel in our body, and that interoception science calls that feeling affect. Affect. And I think I remember we talked about this in the other episode, but you're familiar with that term, right, Travis? Like affect.
Hmm.
It's kind of just like your low level feelings of mood. It's just kind of just very,
Hmm.
this rough base level feelings that are kind of at the base of everything else you're doing. Like, what's your mood today? That's kind of a some representation of interoception. It's that base level. And then sometimes things kind of will rise above that to more of your conscious level. So whereas almost everything going on in the body is below your conscious awareness, certain
Hmm.
things will kind of rise above. And when it comes to interoception, maybe that's something like you start to feel cold. So then you put on that like motivates you to put on a sweater. You feel hungry. So then you're going to eat. You feel like you have to go to the bathroom. Like just these signals that kind of rise up from just being like part of that aggregate affect. They're a little something else. And you know the feeling and you learn to label it. Like that means I have to go to the bathroom. That
Hmm.
means I'm hungry. So these are the ways we experience interoception in more kind of pointed ways, but they're just temporary. And it's these ways that like the brain directs your interoception to motivate you to take behavior,
Hmm.
all in the service of maintaining homeostasis.
Right.
Everything just like in balance inside, basically.
That's
So
so
that's
interesting because as like
right.
a child, you might not know like something's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe you're
Mm-hmm.
hungry, but you don't know like, well, when I feel this, what do I have to do? And so you
Right.
learn, I guess with in conjunction with your parents trying to
Mm-hmm.
puzzle that out, because a baby cries and it's like, well, what's wrong? Do you need to sleep, eat, be changed, whatever?
Oh,
But
right, right,
then
right.
yeah, like through process of, I guess, trial and error, you and your parents
Mhm.
figure out, and then you learn to be self-sufficient at a certain point. Like, oh, when I feel that hunger, food,
Yeah.
cold,
Yeah.
jacket. But
Exactly.
you wouldn't necessarily know until you've like tried a few things. Like, oh, that helps.
Right. You learn like through experience and through what your parents and your family, your culture all kind of tells you. You learn to
Mm-hmm.
label these feelings in your body as being about certain things, these labels that have meaning. And I think when
Mm-hmm.
we think of like our body signals as far as like, I'm hungry, I'm cold, it makes sense to us that those are like feelings we feel in the body. But we
Mm-hmm.
maybe just want to broaden our sense of all of that and realize that it's actually no different with something like pain or emotions or stress. They're also all feelings in the body that we then like label with
Mm-hmm.
these categories that we learned like what they are. That gives them meaning for us. And then that meaning informs us and kind of maybe informs our behavior or things like that. Gives it all context.
Yeah. And
So
it's
it's like
really
kind of
interesting. It's really interesting that culturally it could be different, right?
Yes, and it actually can be. You're totally right. Yes, yes. The way we interpret, like, what goes on in our body can certainly be, different
Yeah.
between cultures, and it is
And I like
different between
from
cultures.
my research with athletic injuries and swimming, like
Yeah.
the culture of sport, when
Yeah.
you experience pain, you're indoctrinated maybe to respond one way. Like in swimming, you're indoctrinated to ignore it
Yes.
because it's a normal phenomenon.
That's
Whereas
right.
outside of it, athletic context or maybe in other sports, that's not what you're supposed to do. And I think a lot of
That's
sports
right,
it
like
is,
a
but
different
outside
culture.
of athletic, yeah, like the cultural context of sport says that you should respond to it this way, and a different context you would be trained to actually maybe acknowledge it more
Like,
and
really
tell
attend to
somebody or
that.
do something about it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. That makes so much sense. So, like, even within the different subcultures within something like sport, there are different approaches to like how you experience the feelings that you have in your body.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's yes. So it so much is like in how we interpret, in our brain, and that's actually leads us to just another important point that I wanted to make sure to point out about interoception and remembering that this includes what I'm about to say includes everything about how what we experience in our body. So this includes pain and emotions and stress and all of that, including our own body signals. But everything that we perceive in our body is the result of kind of influences coming in two directions. And these are called like bottom up and top down. And I'm sure you've heard, I think we talked about this in the other podcast episode too. But everything that you feel in your body is like put there for you to feel by your brain. And it's a combination of what your brain is sensing. So incoming sensory info, whether that's
Mm-hmm.
from the outside world, whether that's from your inner world and like what's going on physiologically, that's all sensory info coming in. So that would be called bottom up. That's what they refer to it as. And then that's combined with top down, like cognitive processing, which consists of things like your past experiences, your beliefs, your brain's expectations about what should be happening right now. All of that gets lumped together, and that's top down. And
Mm-hmm.
it's this aggregate of all of that that your brain then presents for you as far as your experience goes, which
Yeah, and
is,
that
yeah.
happens instantaneously,
Instant.
right? So it's like
Yeah.
not easy to puzzle out, well,
Yes.
what's happening internally, and then what am I layering on from my previous experience? Like that's all automatic.
You're so right. It's automatic. It's what our brains evolved to do. We were like, yeah, it's not, and so we don't have like a conscious. That's not a conscious process.
Yeah, like
Maybe in like bigger, in a
what was
bigger
my past
picture.
experience? What am I feeling? What am I expecting?
Yes.
You know, that we don't go
No,
through
we
that
don't
like
consciously do
through
that.
like what's coming in, what is, what's in the background, and then what's coming out. It just happens.
It's outputted for you all automatically by your brain. But it's interesting to think that maybe, in a bigger picture context, maybe we could have some conscious influence on that in the sense of like, learning more about something like pain and how pain actually works. That may change our beliefs about say the
Yeah.
connection between pain and tissue damage, and or maybe we learn how strong and capable our bodies actually are through something like a strength training practice, and then that just builds more trust in our body, and then that's this reassuring belief that then feeds in. So those types of things, if they change how we see our body, the brain will also, take
Yeah.
that in, and then that might change the output of how we experience our
Right.
body in a bigger
So
picture sense.
you can deliberately shift, create new experiences that then become old experiences that then
Yes.
informed this process, as well as probably, you have an initial response to something, and then you can more deliberately question, well, why am I feeling that way? What am I thinking? What is my past experience? Like, what is my past experience? And can I don't know if override would be the right word, but can I, more deliberately think through this before responding just somewhat automatically?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm really glad you brought that up because I think that kind of brings in kind of the top something that we definitely want to talk about in this episode, which is just the topic of something like yoga and mindfulness practices and what they can be really good at. Which is that, as we all know, as all of our listeners know, I mean, we're familiar with like yoga and mindfulness practices. They really involve like paying attention in the moment without judgment, whether you're just in a seated meditation or like moving through a yoga practice. But all of it, one of the biggest goals and outcomes that can happen from a yoga and mindfulness practice is you start to build a bit of space, or you can start to build a bit of space between like what you experience and then your reaction, your like potential automatic reaction. And if you can start to just take a little bit of space and to just not respond in such a knee-jerk way, that gives you
Hmm.
space to kind of reassess maybe what's really going on, and that can maybe like help regulate your emotions and your responses so that we're, I don't know, more maybe more mature, or just taking in the bigger picture instead of just being so like led around by our reactions all the time.
Yeah, that's profound. And I think people know that.
Hmm.
I think
Hmm.
people go into a yoga or mindfulness practice with that. I don't know if goal is the right word, but that's a desirable outcome, one desirable outcome of that, right? But
Yeah.
when you talk about it in the lens of interoception and the processes,
Hmm.
the inputs and the outputs, and trying to manage that process through a yoga and or mindfulness practice, it's a really interesting way to layer on that scientific understanding of what's happening.
Yes. Absolutely. And this we talked about in our other episode, but I think kind of along with the what we've already said, which is like the common refrain that you should always listen to your body and that's best. We always kind of hear that, but then we can maybe take a step back and maybe question that. I think we also another thing we also tend to hear about yoga and mindfulness practices specifically is that they improve interoception. Like that's a
Mm,
very, very common, stated benefit of yoga and mindfulness practices. And I think when you actually start to look into the science of interoception, you start to realize that that's also not necessarily as simple as the statement may make it seem. Do you
right.
remember
Well,
how we talked about this
yeah,
before?
yeah, because interoception is not, well, one, measuring it is tricky, and two, or maybe that's two, and one is just that there are different kinds of interoception.
Exactly. And so I wanted to make sure we outline these because these will be very informative for everything else we talk about today. But I think it's important that we realize that, yeah, interoception, is what we've been talking about. But when you're really talking about like someone's interoception, it's more complex. And traditionally in the research looking into interoception had kind of been not super clear in its definitions for what it was really talking about when it was like maybe measuring interoceptive abilities, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Got kind of confusing. And so in 2015, there was this paper by Garfinkel put out where those researchers really just kind of wanted to establish a common terminology for interoception that the field could then kind of use as shared, language moving forward so that things like make more sense when we're operating with common definitions.
It's good practice. But it's
Exactly.
funny that it took until 8 years ago, right?
Right, right. And also in a lot of interoception science is relatively recent. This field has like really been
Mm-hmm.
growing and kind of blowing up, but especially recently. So it's really good that these researchers kind of set this down. And my impression is that what they've set down as like these terms tends to pretty much be the working terms that subsequent research has used. Some research I see maybe doesn't, but most of it seems to. So I think this will be really helpful for informing us in how we think about interoception and in just listening to the body. Because here's the deal. Interoception has three main components. We can break it down into three things. And the first component is called interoceptive accuracy. And what that is that's just your ability to accurately perceive your actual body sensations. So, like, say the heartbeat,
Mm-hmm.
you can hear I mean, if you can hear your heartbeat, or maybe you can feel your heartbeat, like you're clearly perceiving something. But if you were to like count your heartbeat out, that that may not necessarily be your actual heartbeat as measured by like a machine, something like actually objective. Like you may think that you're counting out your heartbeat, you get a certain number, but actually it's different. And
Mm-hmm.
that's because the way what we feel in our body is an output by the brain. That's that combination of bottom up and top down. It's not we never 100% sense pure raw sensory info. We never do in anything like how we experience our body and the world. It's always this filtered representation the brain presents. And therefore, it's not 100% like pure objective reality. So the way that we feel our body is not necessarily exactly what's going on in our body. And interoception science like really tells us that. So one component of interoception is just how accurate you are, interoceptive accuracy. Did I define that clearly? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So in a research study, one way of measuring interoception, and it's really just interoceptive accuracy, they would have people, they would have a heart rate monitor on people, and they would count the beats per minute for 60 seconds. And then they would ask the people, what do you think your heart rate is? Without actually measuring it on themselves, just sit there
Mm-hmm.
quietly for a minute. What did it feel like your heart rate was? They would report out, it felt like 60 beats a minute. And then they would compare that to the actual reading. And if you're
Exactly.
closer to the actual reading, then your interoceptive accuracy is higher. And if you're
Exactly.
farther off, then you're farther off.
Yeah.
That, I think you're, well, nah, that sounds clear cut, right? That it is somewhat clear cut. But then the question is, well, what does it mean to have greater interoceptive accuracy or less interoceptive accuracy? Is that important and relevant in
Right. Exactly. And
in
yeah.
other to anything? it's
Well,
it's
that's the
certainly one way of measuring what's going on, but then what are the ramifications of that?
exactly. What
What
does it
being
really
good or
mean?
being bad?
So that's interoceptive accuracy is just one of the three components. The second component is interoceptive sensibility, and that is something that's measured via questionnaires, and that's just how good you think you are at your interoception. Basically, it's your subjective sense of how well you sense your body. That's interoceptive sensibility,
So
and that's different.
you would ask somebody, how good do you think you're going to do at this task of, we're going to measure your heart rate,
Hmm.
you're going to tell me your heart rate, and they'll say, well, I think I'm going to be really good at it. And maybe they are, or maybe they're not.
That's right. And my
Or I think I'm going to be really bad at it, and maybe they are, or maybe they're
exactly. And in the research I see, they usually ask the people after they reported. They're like, "How good do you feel? How confident are you
not.
that you were
Okay, that
accurate?"
makes sense.
And
Because
they ask them
there's,
after, and then they
yeah,
like
there's
rate
like,
it.
well, I expect to be this good, but until you've actually done it and
Yeah,
tried it, because you might do it and you're like, well, I'm actually not that sure. Or like, yeah, I'm super sure that I was
exactly.
60 beats per minute and the true number was 60 beats per minute.
Right, right. So that's like assessing your confidence. And then there are these questionnaires that also just in general assess like how well you think you pay attention to your body, how good you think your interoception is. And then finally, the third component of interoception is kind of this more umbrella term, which is interoceptive awareness. And that's the correspondence between the other two. So that's basically how well yeah, it's a little complicated, but how good you think your interoception is corresponds to how good your interoception actually is as far as
Right.
accuracy goes. So
So it's a 2 by 2 table where
yeah,
you could agree, but you could agree in two ways. You could have high awareness that you are good at that your interoceptive accuracy is good, or you could have high awareness that your interoceptive accuracy is bad, or you could have low
exactly.
awareness in with either disagreeing combination.
Exactly. So if I was like, "Hey Travis, how good is your interoception?" You were like, "It's bad." And then if we actually measured you accuracy-wise and it was bad, you would
Hmm.
actually have good interoceptive awareness because you knew that you weren't good.
Yeah.
It's really crazy. Right, right. So or if you know you're good and you are good, but if you think you're good and then you're not good on an accuracy, a test, then you
Yeah.
actually, that wouldn't be a good correspondence.
Or if you
So
think
not
that
good.
you're bad but you're good, that would
Yes,
still not be
exactly.
good correspondence.
Exactly. So I think this is just to show that it's complicated, right? It's complicated. And when we're talking about something like, does a yoga and mindfulness or yoga or a mindfulness practice, does that improve interoception? It's
Hmm.
like, well, what do we mean? Like, do we mean accuracy? Do we mean confidence?
Yeah.
Um, and so we actually know this. And I want to say we don't really know it. Like the research so far suggests, but I don't think we
Hmm.
can say that this is totally conclusive.
Yeah.
But research so far suggests that yoga and mindfulness practices do not improve interoceptive accuracy,
Hmm.
but they do improve interoceptive sensibility, which is like our confidence in how good we are with our
Which makes
interoception.
sense, right? Well,
Yes,
you would
it
hope,
does.
I suppose, that it would if interoceptive accuracy turns out to be important, you would hope that it that yoga and mindfulness practices improved it. But it's not surprising that they improve our sensibility. Like, oh, we're doing this
Mhm.
thing that we think improves our accuracy, so therefore we think our accuracy is better as a result of it, which is really just our the sensibility.
Exactly. And if what a yoga practice and a meditation practice and anything that falls under the umbrella of mindfulness, if one of the main things you're doing is you're paying attention to your body as you're moving, then by definition you are paying attention to your body and maybe the signals that are coming from your body or your breath or these things the teacher may direct your attention toward. So that definitely may help enhance your confidence in the fact that you like listen to your, I mean, you do listen to your body, you do it like on the yoga mat, but
Yeah.
that doesn't mean you necessarily accurately hear your body, you know? It's not, those 2 things are not the same thing. And so, yeah, what research really suggests is that yoga and mindfulness practices make us feel like we, like, know our body better, but they don't
Hmm.
actually make us know our body better on an accuracy level. I found that, like, mind-blowing when I first learned that.
Yeah, because then it's like, well, what does improve your interoceptive accuracy?
Well, I think a good question is what you already posed, which is just,
And
is it
does
really
it matter?
important? Yeah, like,
Right.
does it really matter? And
Or
actually, I
or
think we're going to talk about that today or in
mhm,
some of our other content.
yeah.
But I think one important point about interoceptive accuracy is that, and I don't think this is widely known, but heightened levels of interoceptive accuracy, so like accurately perceiving your body signals, is actually correlated with anxiety. And I wonder if that sort of resonates for you, Travis, or if you could kinda, like, see, I feel like intuitively I could see that.
Sure.
Maybe corresponds with, maybe being a little more hyper vigilant, a little more, like, I'm really listening and it's kind of, making me anxious. But,
Mhm.
the 2 are correlated, that people who have anxiety tend to also have higher accuracy as far like, actual accuracy.
Right, so like, do we really want well, and
Exactly.
maybe we can't actually maybe it's just something that we're born with, and we
Yeah,
can't
that I don't
necessarily
know.
affect it. Yeah,
I mean, we
probably
know that
a little
yoga and
early on.
mindfulness. Yeah. It seems that yoga and mindfulness practices don't improve it, but maybe some other type of practice could if you wanted
Right.
to, but I don't know how important it really is.
Yeah.
So you might remember, Travis, that when we talked about this in the last episode, there was this great study from 2019 by Ferenzi et al. That looked at subjective well-being and people who had higher levels of well-being. And what it basically found was that people who had higher well-being levels, that was associated with interoceptive sensibility, with the subjective aspect of interoception, and it was not
Mm-hmm.
associated with the accuracy. And so basically that's just kind of pointing to what I think you and I are already maybe suggesting, which is that what really matters is just that you feel like you listen to your body, like you feel like you pay attention, you feel like you know your body. That's what seems to be correlated with well-being, not so much whether you accurately sense your body.
So yeah, a bit counterintuitive, but not a bad thing. Not like a nail in the coffin for we shouldn't be doing mindfulness and yoga practices because it doesn't help.
Oh no, not at all. Like 100% opposite of that, I would
Just
say.
doesn't help
Yeah.
the way we thought it would, but maybe that is not so important.
Yeah, if you think accurately sensing your body is important, and that's what the assumption tends to be, then yeah, maybe
Hmm.
you'd be a little disappointed. But I think the point is, it turns out that's probably not what's really important. That's like not what our bodies evolved to do. We're not really like, our brain didn't evolve to reflect reality accurately. It just evolved to maintain homeostasis. That's like what it's all about. And
Hmm.
so mindfulness and yoga practices are great because they help us feel like we sense our body better. They just don't actually help us actually sense our body accurately better. It's crazy.
Hmm.
So, with kind of this as like an established base of what listening to your body like really is and how we do that in like a yoga and mindfulness practice, maybe we can talk a bit about pain and like painful conditions and rehab and because this is completely relevant for all of that. Like, isn't one of
Yeah.
the first things we learn when we learn about pain science that like pain can happen without tissue damage, and people can have tissue damage and have no pain?
Right. Which is mind blowing and not something that everybody necessarily knows. So
That's
let let
right.
that sink in for a second. And we've probably talked about it before, but
Right. But wouldn't you agree that like that's just like very
Mhm.
established in the research now?
Yeah, it like throughout the body, lots of studies, all different
Mhm.
parts of the body.
And what does that look like, Travis? Like, just like people will get scans, like MRI
Right. So
scans
you'll
that.
do imaging, MRIs, they'll find structural abnormalities and in perhaps most people
Mhm.
and the people who have the structural abnormalities are not the same people that are complaining about pain. And then the people who are complaining about pain may have no structural abnormalities at all.
That's
And that
right.
could
That's
be
right.
the spine, that could be the shoulder.
The
Um,
knee,
yeah,
the
all
hip,
over.
like all of it. Right. So it's, I guess, not to say that structure has like no role in pain, not to say that,
Right, right,
but
right.
just to suggest that we know from research there's not a one-to-one correlation.
Yeah, it's not everything. So it's not that it doesn't matter and that it never matters. It's just that it's not the full picture because it's not this perfect one to one of the more damage you have, the more pain you have, or vice versa.
Right, right. So like pain and tissue damage are not necessarily correlated. And,
Hmm.
as we talked about just in our last podcast episode, remember that a lot of diagnoses in the rehab world are really trending toward just being non-specific. Like someone has
Hmm.
non-specific low back pain or rotator cuff related shoulder pain rather than calling it impingement. Like that's like
Yeah,
not really the favorite term. So it's just like we don't really know what tissue, if any tissue, like it could just be, yeah, pain is biopsychosocial.
right.
I feel like we
Which
talk.
and it goes right back to what we said with about interoception, right?
Yeah. Which
It's
is
like
why
okay,
pain
we
is
we're experiencing this one thing, but it's colored by our past experiences and our expectations. So if
exactly
we have those past experiences, expectations that are lending us to think that we should have pain when we feel something, then we produce that feeling of pain.
precisely. So once again, just casual things we might hear, like black or white statements, like if you're moving in a certain way and you feel pain when you do it, that means you're hurting yourself. That
Hmm.
means you're causing, like, these are the types of things that I think like 99% of society thinks, because of course, why wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But when you actually learn more about the science of pain and now interoception, you start to realize like that's actually, that's not 100% true and can
Right.
be misleading.
Hmm.
Yeah, and so there's this cool study, Travis, that I wanted to tell you about in case you haven't read this one before. I'm not sure if you have, but it's called Feeling Stiffness in the Back, Protective Perceptual Inference in Chronic Back Pain. And Laura Mosley is one of the authors on it. And I'm sure you know who like huge pain science researcher. And
Hmm.
have you heard of this study before?
I don't think so. So
It's such a
it's
cool one that's
new to
just
me.
super, yeah, it's super in line with like what we've been talking about and just the whole concept of listening to your body and like, should we always listen and what is it? What do your signals mean? And so basically, this study looked at people who had chronic low back pain and feelings of back stiffness. And then they so they measured their feelings of stiffness in the back, but then they actually
Like asked them
yeah,
how stiff they
yeah,
felt their back was.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But then they actually biomechanically measured the stiffness in their back by having them like
Hmm.
lay on a table, and they had this like instrument that protruded into their back at a certain force. And
Hmm.
they tested biomechanically like how stiff the back actually was, and then
Hmm.
they compared actual objective biomechanical stiffness to just feelings of feeling stiff. And there was no correlation. So people could feel stiff, but not actually biomechanically be stiff.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, that's just in line with everything we would say. Like what we feel in our body is not necessarily accurately reflective of what's actually going on in the body.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
And that kind of makes it's not surprising necessarily because the way of measuring stiffness that you just described, it's like that's true engineering definition mechanical stiffness. And then there's like, oh, my back feels stiff, which is just
yeah,
like something that we've layered on to that feeling and we call it
exactly.
stiffness.
Exactly. And what this study also found was that people who had low back pain, they experienced the probe that went into their back. They estimated the amount of force as being higher than people who didn't have back pain.
Okay.
So the people who didn't have back pain, they estimated the amount of the force because they were asked to estimate. They estimated at a lower amount than the people who had pain, even though it was the same amount of force for
Yeah.
everybody.
Right.
So, like, the implication that the researchers suggested was that just this idea that the stiffness, the perception of stiffness is more about your brain just kind of trying to create protection around a
Right.
region, but it's not necessarily like an accurate reflection of what's actually going on. And then the other cool thing, just to point out how complex all of this is and how multimodal and multisensory something like interoception is, it's like a combination of so much all lumped together, is that in the same study, they also did the same back probing thing, but they paired it with playing a sound in the background. And it was really cool. So they had like in one condition, there was no sound. In one condition, there was a whoosh sound.
I was gonna
And
say, what's
then
the sound? Was it like a gong?
right, it
I
was a
don't
whoosh,
know why that was the sound that came to my mind, but
because
okay,
that's
a
like kind of
whoosh.
peaceful or whatever.
Yeah.
Right, but I could see a gong, but they just did a whoosh. And then the third condition was that playing the sound of a creaky door.
Ooh, gosh.
And so I think it might intuitively make sense, but this is what they objectively found, was that when the creaky door was played as the probe went into the back, people rated the force as higher. Like they estimated that it was high. Like it felt like more when they heard the creaky door
Wow.
compared to the whoosh and no sound. So and then that was just the researchers then were like, just to show like your perception of pain, it's influenced by so
Yeah.
much. It's
Right.
not
Because
just,
that has nothing like the sound.
yeah.
The sound they were not changing the force, and it was changing the way people experienced it.
Precisely. They didn't change the force. It was the same the whole time, but based on a sound they heard, which that's just, also based on past experience, based on so much stuff
Hmm.
the brain integrates and then outputs for you. It's like what you actually feel may not
Wow.
be objective reality.
So we should
Isn't
just
that
walk
crazy?
around with a whoosh noise
You're
in
totally
our
right.
earbuds.
This sounds like a nice
that'll,
sounding
that'll
noise.
that'll smooth everything over.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Just always the whoosh. But I feel like
Sounds
that's a good
dangerous while driving.
right, right, totally. But it's a good study to point out just to highlight further what we've already been saying, which is that what you feel in your body is not necessarily reflective of what's actually accurately going on in your body. And we kind of already
Hmm.
know that, but actually seeing, this type of research I think is extra interesting and informative. Um
Hmm.
so yeah, so if we know that like feeling pain or feeling stiffness doesn't necessarily mean there's tissue damage or actual stiffness, like what does that then suggest about something like physical therapy and rehab and treating people with painful conditions? Like there's a lot of talk about that,
Jeez.
right?
Right. So if somebody's reporting stiffness, they come in, they say, my back's stiff. And then you
Mhm.
test it. And then, like, first of all, most physical therapists don't have that gadget,
Yes, that
right?
like probe, that
So that
gadget, yeah.
they're using their hand and they're like pressing into your L5 and they're like, well, this feels like a bit immobile compared to the other segments. It's like, well, is that actually does that correlate with the objective measurement? So
Can you
that's a
really
different.
feel that with your finger?
Yeah, yeah. But then like so they're either saying, "Oh yeah, you're right, you are stiff," or "Oh, actually you're not stiff." Well, then the person's still stiff. They want to not be they want to
Yeah.
not
Yeah,
the
they
person
feel
still
stiff.
feels
They
like they're
feel
stiff.
stiff,
Yeah.
yeah.
They still feel stiff. They want to not feel stiff. What does that mean from an intervention standpoint? Do you
Mhm.
stretch them because then or do you prescribe stretches because that their expectation is that I'm stiff, I need
Mm.
stretches, and then they do the thing and it helps because it matches their expectation. Do you strengthen because you as the therapist believe that well, whenever somebody's tight, I've found that when we strengthen that tight that stiffness resolves, so that you tell them that, and then they believe that
Mhm.
because you've
They
told them
believe
that
that
and
in their
you're
brain.
the doctor.
Yeah.
Or do you say we're just gonna walk and that'll help, and they're like, well, that's not what I was expecting? Or do you say I'm just gonna explain to you that this perception of
Mhm.
stiffness that you're having is not reflective of reality because of this cool study from 2019 that Laura Mosley was a part of? And so you just educate them, or like there are so many options, right? So how does
Mhm.
one know what to do, coupling that with the patient's expectations walking in, of you asking them, well, what do you expect will help, what do you think will help you, what have you done before, what have you tried so far?
Do you think that kind of putting it in such a presenting it as there are so many options like that, maybe suggests that like what someone like a physical therapist or a clinician might want to do is just really try to get to know the patient and get some communication from the patient about like what their mentality is, what their preferences are, and kind of use that to shape what they decide to do since there are potentially so many ways they could go.
Yeah, I think so. The challenge lies, and we've probably maybe talked about this before, if the patient comes in and they're like, well, I want ultrasound. Ultrasound has
Mhm.
helped my back stiffness before. I don't know if that's actually used, but some sort of passive modality. And really, as the clinician, you're like, I think that's a waste of time. I don't think that's going to do anything. Then do you still give it to him, or do you say, well, my understanding of the research is that that doesn't really help. I suggest we try strengthening or stretching or
Mhm.
walking, or let me just explain to you. Just listen to this podcast on interoception.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that's the correct approach would be to hear them out, ask them what they are expecting, and then you can match that expectation if you think that what they're expecting is in line with what you think works for your
Right, right,
understanding
right.
of
Like, maybe
of the
it's a
research coupled with
two-way
your
street.
experience. Yeah, you try not to give them something that isn't going to do anything, is going to be a waste of time, unless it's like, well, we could do that for 5 minutes because they think it's going to help and feel good, and then we can
Mhm.
go and do something else maybe.
That's more evidence-based or
Yeah, but
yeah.
I think ultimately there's probably a lot of options, like
Right. Which is
a
really
combination of, maybe it's all those things, or maybe you try the things one by one, uh, and you find the one that works for them.
totally. That makes a lot of sense, and I think, like, what you're describing here as far as just how maybe complex and kinda confusing all of this could be navigating this is partly because, I don't know, like a lot. I feel like it's more, although pain science itself has been around for decades, it's actually not new, but it's new that it's becoming more widely understood. And the field of physical therapy was also established decades ago. So I think physical therapy has a long history of being rooted in a paradigm which didn't really embrace like the biopsychosocial, phenomenon of pain. And so a lot of physical therapists do
Maybe still
treat.
doesn't
Right. A lot of
in
PT does not.
in
Well,
some
yeah.
circles.
Yeah. And so a lot of PT is outdated in the way that it understands how pain works. And it thinks it's more, it doesn't maybe understand the top down and bottom up and the whole, what you feel isn't necessarily what's actually going, like just this whole thing. And if instead you're in this other model that's just like pain and tissue damage one to one. So if you hurt, we need to protect. I don't know. It's just like there's a lot of outdated mentality, and a lot of it's in that more oversimplified model. So maybe that's
Hmm.
why it just seems like it's a lot of the dialogue in the PT world these days is like, we need to update and be this way. But this new way is it's just a lot more complex because the body and pain are complex.
Right.
It's a lot easier to just be like, ultrasound, I'm just going to give you this passive treatment and I'll fix or I'll correct your misalignment, or I'll break up your fascial adhesions or just
Yeah.
all this stuff.
Yeah. Let me
But
just crack your back and then your
exactly.
stiffness will be gone.
But
And
Travis,
maybe it helps in the moment, but
maybe
then they
temporarily, yeah,
then they come back the next week with the stiffness again.
exactly. But Travis, when it comes to rehab, a lot of physical therapy is based on exercise and prescribing exercise and movement. And
Hmm.
what I feel like is there's a lot of talk these days around is pain during that exercise that you prescribe. Or as a clinician. And so like there's this big question that I think is really relevant for this topic of like listening to the body,
Right.
which is if someone's doing their rehab exercises, should they not feel any pain? Is it bad if they feel pain? If they do feel pain, is it actually good? Like what should they listen to the
Yes.
body and not do the exercise? Is it okay? Like what's going on
Right.
with all that?
So this was like the first thing that I learned as a personal trainer was if it hurts,
Hmm.
don't do it, which is a
Hmm.
subset of listen to your body, right? Uh,
Yes, it is.
listen to your body. If it hurts, don't do it. And I subscribed to that notion for a long time and still do in some cases. But
Hmm.
maybe 5 years ago, I was listening to a podcast and they were talking about maybe it was like Achilles tendinopathy rehab or something like that. And they were like, oh, actually maybe it's okay or maybe even necessary to poke into a little bit of pain
Hmm.
during rehab. And I was like, whoa, what? I thought that if it hurts, don't do it. And then I was like, oh, okay, I see that that's a particular application.
Right.
Maybe that's still good advice in some cases, which I think still maybe to an extent it is, but it's not as black and white as I had been told it was and thought it was when I found out that there was this counter example and then came to learn that there were more counter examples. So years later, I read a study on hamstring strain rehabilitation,
Mhm.
and they compared. So the big picture, like everybody's trying to get, and these injuries usually happen to soccer players. Everybody's trying to get people back faster. So how can we speed up
Right.
the recovery process so that we can get our soccer players or our football players back on the pitch faster, back
Yeah,
on the
yeah.
field faster? So let's try seeing if we have two groups, one that if it hurts, don't do it, like our control group, and then the other, they're allowed to work into some pain. And in that study, I think they were, if you look at a numerical rating scale or a visual analog scale where 0 is no pain and 10 is the worst pain imaginable, they're allowing people to work into a 4 out of 10. So
Mhm.
anything 4 or less was fair game that they could continue exercising. Whereas the other group, I forget the control group, I forget exactly what their cutoff was. Maybe it was no pain at all. And I think what they were hoping to find again was that the group that we let poke into pain recovers faster. Their performance measures are better. What they ended up finding was no difference, or very few differences, or very little difference between the two groups, which is
Mhm.
still a somewhat favorable outcome. like best case scenario, they would have found, oh, look, like we let
It gets
people poke into
better.
pain and they do better. Yeah.
Yeah.
But at the very least, it's not worse. So we don't have to worry so much about
Yeah.
like, oh, you can't be in any pain when you rehab. Like, no, it's okay to be in some pain and you will wind up in the same place by the end of this
Right.
if you are. So that's kind of encouraging because then you don't have to worry about it or fear it. And
Exactly.
so you can that's a very particular application again, but there are a few of these applications.
Mhm.
And so the numerical pain rating is one thing. There are other sorts of considerations that you can probably make. um, it's it's still tricky because as a personal trainer or as I think a yoga teacher, it's
Yeah.
really outside of our scope to
Totally.
be recommended. Like if somebody has pain, then that's outside the scope first of all.
Yes,
And
that's
that,
right.
it's a
To
more
even be
nuanced discussion
treating or
because
yeah.
we can't treat pain, we can work around pain, but we
Yeah.
can't work through pain. But I think you can let people know, like, hey, I can't, as a yoga teacher or fitness professional, tell you to work into that pain, but I can let you know that there's research
Yes.
that shows that it might be okay. Still think maybe you should work with an experienced, under the supervision of an experienced professional. But here are some other contexts to think about, like, have you been there before? Have you poked into pain before and it's been okay? Are you able to, like, do you feel in control? Are you able to maintain your breathing pattern
Mhm.
as you're doing it? So that, but again, it's like that should probably be under the realm of,
Of a
or under the
actual
supervision of an
medical
actual
professional.
medical professional.
Mhm.
But it's interesting, and long story short, it's not this clear cut black and white. If it hurts, don't do it. Always listen to your
That's
body.
right.
It's, oh wow, there might be several applications or instances where it's okay, and whether that's the 4 out of 10, or some people go even higher than that, 5 out of 10 on that 10-point
Right.
scale.
Yeah. I think maybe using the example of like this research is really like the point is just to suggest that it's maybe not as simple or black and white as never push into pain, like in a rehab context, like that if you feel pain during your exercise that means you're damaging your tissues or worsening the
Right.
injury. Like that's what I think we used to think.
Yeah, and another example, I don't there I'm sure there's research on this, but just like from an understanding standpoint, sometimes you might have chronic back pain. And as a
Mhm.
protective mechanism, you're avoiding bending forward because that's what hurts.
Right.
And maybe exactly what you need to do is bend forward, because it's not that you have tissue damage or that bending forward is going to cause tissue damage. It's that you've been avoiding that motion for so long that that's kind of the thing that's perpetuating the pain, is the avoidance and um the lack of variability. So you,
Yes.
like, exposing yourself to that in a safe fashion, maybe
Yes.
that's in like a more unloaded setting, or
Cat cow
maybe,
maybe, like rounding the
yeah.
spine. Like very
Hmm.
low load and maybe that's not
Yeah.
as threatening.
Or in a way where you're a little distracted, so you're like doing something else, you don't know. Your physical therapist is like throwing a ball, and then the ball rolls and you pick it up and you didn't even think about it because you were playing a game. And
Right.
then afterwards the PT's like, hey, by the way, you picked that up and it was just fine. And they're like, oh, what? Because it violates their expectation, so that then they
Exactly.
can feel more comfortable and free to move into that position. And just breaking that barrier, it could be
Mhm.
ultimately what contributes to helping with break out of the painful cycle.
That's right, and, like, that great example you just gave about people who, maybe they've come to, like their brain is just associated that when they bend forward, they experience pain in the back. They perceive that, like, just become, I don't know, wired together or whatever, but it
Yeah, because
doesn't
it
mean
did
there's
hurt
any
for
damage, but
yeah.
that example reminds me of this distinction that we've seen like Greg Lehman lay out before, which was like endurance copers versus avoiders.
Mhm.
And like in the PT world, it seems like you could maybe think of patients as kind of being on a spectrum between one of those two. These are like end extremes, but
Yeah.
like an avoider would be the example of what you're talking about, like someone never going into a certain movement and always avoiding it. Almost because they're
Mhm.
listening to their body. Maybe you could suggest they're listening to their body too much. They're just always like, I can never feel the pain. I'm never going to do
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Versus on the other side of the spectrum, the endurance coper, which my understanding of that term is that's like someone who maybe could be suggesting maybe they don't listen to their body enough, and they
Right.
just like always push through like your stereotypical type A. They're like never
Mhm.
listening, and they're always pushing. And maybe in both of those cases, these are just extremes and kind of archetypal examples. But maybe
Right.
in both of those cases, there's an issue with listening to the body where maybe one could actually listen more and back off more, and the other could listen less and realize they could open themselves up to more movement.
Totally.
And all of that's just navigated around just all of this. Like, what is pain and how are we perceiving it? What does it mean? Like, it's kind of crazy.
Mhm.
But yeah. So, pain during exercise does not necessarily mean that you're creating damage in your body. But that doesn't mean like our audience, most of the people listening to our podcast are like yoga and movement teachers. And that doesn't mean that we are suggesting that yoga teachers tell students to push through pain. Like, that's not.
Right.
But, you gave some really good, advice for yoga teachers a few minutes ago, and I was just gonna kind of add on to that, that for me as a yoga teacher, I feel like this information, it doesn't necessarily inform me as far as treating any student with pain because I don't treat pain, like, that's not within my scope of practice, but it informs me more in terms of my teaching language, how I talk about the body, how I
Yeah.
might talk about pain. I'm gonna go out of my way to try not to create, like, anxiety about pain. I definitely might
Mhm.
not say, "Everybody push into your pain," but I'm also not gonna say if to go out of my way to make people afraid of it, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and I also feel that just having a working understanding of all this info, even yoga teachers are not treating and diagnosing pain, but our students still very frequently come up to us and want to talk to us about their painful conditions. And
Yes.
often they think that we're qualified to help them with pain. And
Yeah.
to have a clear sense of our lane, we should know that we're not, unless we also are PTs or something.
Right.
But I think it's still helpful to be up to date on all this so that we can talk to our students about their painful conditions. If they want to talk to us, we can do so in a way that, maybe doesn't instill nocebo and that understands these bigger picture ideas. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Totally. Right. So
Yeah.
even though the treatment and the diagnosis and treatment aren't part of the scope of a fitness professional or a yoga teacher,
Hmm.
it doesn't mean that this knowledge can't be helpful in the way that we frame just
Yes.
in leading a class or have those conversations after class, before class with students one on one.
Precisely, precisely. And also because pain science, as we now understand, it's like rooted in interoception science. That's like the broader umbrella for all of it. And we know that in a yoga and or mindfulness practice, like interoception is like a huge part of what we're doing. So I think to do our best to just have a working understanding of how all those processes are working, then understanding pain is a big part of that, just as much as all the other processes that are part of interoception, just kind of part of feeding into that as well. Even though,
Hmm.
like, just trying to justify why all of this is important, for yoga teachers specifically, even though we don't treat or diagnose pain.
Right.
Another point that I thought was interesting as far as this, like, listening to your body convo, and this is just kind of a quickie that I wanted us to touch on, but this just has to do with stretching. And I
Right.
don't think this is going to inform us as far as, whether we should listen to the body or not. But it's
Yeah.
yet another example of the fact that, like, what we feel in our body is not necessarily an accurate representation of what's going on in the body. And that has to do with stretching.
Hmm.
And that's because, like, what happened, like, when you go into a stretch, like a hamstring stretch, like, what happens as far as, like, what you feel? Like, why do you stop stretching? Like, what creates the end of your stretch?
You usually stop because it feels uncomfortable. And you
Right.
feel like, okay, that's it. That's all I've
Yeah.
got, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you feel
But
like
is
that's,
that
like your end range, or what we might call, like, biomechanically, that's your mechanical end range. We might
mhm.
feel like that. But as you said, you feel uncomfortable. And now, as we've kind of established in this whole episode, what's a feeling? It's just like a perception your brain has put there for you to feel.
Right. As
Ideally,
a
with the
protection in
yes,
that case.
in that case, yeah. Because ideally, all of our feelings in our body are about maintaining homeostasis, keeping everything in balance. So your brain is probably just trying to motivate you to not go further.
Mm-hmm.
But what we actually know from stretching research, and again, we won't go too deep into this right now, but just that there's this phenomenon called stretch tolerance, and that is largely what actually determines your stopping point in a stretch. It's not like you actually like when people go under anesthesia and they're not conscious anymore, they can actually stretch further than they could when they were conscious. They
Yeah.
have more mechanical range, but when they're awake, their brain just kind of holds them back. So anyway, does that kind of make sense that that's what stretch tolerance is? And it's like this output by your brain for you to feel in your body?
Yeah. And different people have different stretch tolerances, right? So some people
Yes.
can get closer to their true mechanical end range and other people less. And you
Yes.
can maybe, well, and when you increase your range of motion over time with the stretching intervention, it might have more to do with increasing your stretch tolerance than
I believe
actually
mhm.
anything else physiological.
I believe
Not
that
that that's
research
not physiological,
suggests
but it's
yeah, right?
neuromuscular.
But it's not like tissues and biomechanics. Yeah, I believe that's what research suggests, is that stretch tolerance is the primary mechanism by which we increase flexibility, but there are sometimes people take that too far and they say stretching is all about stretch tolerance, and I don't
Mm.
believe that's what research supports. Actually, stretching does actually create some mechanical changes in the tissues. Again, maybe another conversation for another podcast, but
Yeah, that seems that particular topic seems to have gone back and forth a lot, and it's
mhm.
like you said, it's probably a little bit of both.
Yeah.
Maybe one
I
more
think
so
it's
than the other, but not.
majority stretch tolerance,
Yeah, it's not
which doesn't
no.
surprise me.
It's not entirely stretch tolerance.
Exactly. It, as again, right? Things are never black or white, right? It's always complex. But I think the main point speaks to just the power of our perceptions and what the brain creates for us, and all of that, is like really huge and I think often underappreciated.
Mm-hmm.
But speaking of all of that, let's turn our attention to this final topic we wanted to talk about today, which is like performance and maybe a little bit of recovery. And
Mm-hmm.
this is more kind of in the realm of like athletes and athletic performance. And you, Travis Pollen, you happen to be an athlete,
Back in my
a
day,
medal winning, record holding swimmer, Paralympic
former
swimmer.
former record holding Paralympic swimmer, but yeah, I'll take it.
So you know what
Actually, just
it's.
found my medals in my parents' basement.
Oh,
And
awesome.
I was like,
I want
wait,
to
why
see
are these
those.
in why are these in my parents' basement? I should be showing these off. So I took them to work and hung them up in my
Oh,
office.
that's so appropriate to put in your office at
good
work.
good conversation starter.
Yeah, that's excellent. I want to send me a picture. I want to see those. That's very cool.
Deal.
But so you know a lot from personal experience about like being an athlete, and there are different types of athletes, but I think some of what we want to talk about today has to do with endurance athletes,
Hmm.
because that's kind of where actually we might want to talk about more than just that, but we definitely want to talk about that and the role of like listening to your body, especially with regard to endurance athletes. Like, do you have any what's your personal experience around when you were swimming, and um, like what sort of signals did you take from your body when you should stop, or did you not, or
I mean, you're like the whole premise with endurance sport is like trying to push through your body telling you to stop, right?
that's right,
Uh,
Travis.
especially in longer distance races,
Right,
marathons,
right.
in particular with running, but long
Hmm.
distance events and swimming too. Like everything's telling you this hurts. I need
Yeah,
to stop. And then you're like, no, I need to push past this.
totally. Like I'm not like an endurance athlete at all, but I wanted to learn a little bit about this, so I did a little research, like what do people say, and I read mostly about runners. But
Hmm.
I just read a lot of just really reputable sources that were ways to give advice and tips to endurance athletes and runners on like how to, literally the quote is like push through the pain.
Yeah.
Like literally that's what you're supposed to do, is push
Yeah.
through the pain. Um
Yeah.
yeah,
Like
in
try to
like
train yourself not to feel it, but to ignore it. Get used to the discomfort. Like, don't
Right,
stop
right.
on the first signal or the second, or like when you're running a marathon. Oh, you're going to hit a wall at 20 miles.
Mhm.
You have to break that wall down. And if
That's
you can get
right.
past that,
Then
then
you're
you can finish the marathon.
because ultimately, and we know, of course, there are extremes, but ultimately, it's the case that our bodies are capable of more than they
Right.
often signal to us, right?
Right.
That's like
So
kind of the
you
main
can,
point.
yeah, you can break through that 20-mile barrier and finish the marathon and recover from that. Uh, a marathon might actually be extreme, another
Mhm.
extreme example, because running a marathon actually is not, that's not like a good,
Right, right,
healthy
right. It's true.
thing to do. But just from the standpoint of like, yeah, if you go out and run 3-4 miles, it's going to hurt. And
Yeah,
if you push through it, you can that can actually produce a favorable adaptation. You
that's
know,
right.
you have more that you can give than you think you can give if you listen to that first signal to stop. Um,
Exactly.
so yeah, generally it is okay to push and not listen
In that
at first, but
context.
yeah, you
Yeah,
can't take it so far to such an extreme that you could cause damage to yourself, or you want
right.
to avoid that.
And but that's like I think what makes this that relevant to this conversation. It's just like yeah, I mean sometimes the signals that your body is sending you just may not really be accurate as far as what your actual physiological limits are. And with
Hmm.
something like running or say like strength training, which is like a different form of exercise, things are uncomfortable and even like with strength training we technically do like micro damage, at the cellular level through like lifting weights or something, but that's what then signals our muscles to then adapt and grow stronger, or that could be part of the process.
Right.
So it's not necessarily a bad thing. And with running, you're like pushing your edge, and maybe you're weaker and you're tired after, but that's actually just like part of the whole bigger picture to come back
Right.
stronger. And
Yeah, like
yeah,
in strength training, you don't stop once it hurts. You stop once you can't do it anymore.
yeah, you're right,
with
Travis.
within reason
Within
of,
reason.
well, if I'm going to such an extreme that my I'm lifting something heavy and my form is deteriorating so much that it becomes
Hmm.
dangerous, you want to
Totally.
you want to not do that. But
Totally.
you don't want to stop like, oh, that hurts a little, like, yeah, it's supposed to hurt.
It's supposed to be uncomfortable. Like that's
Yeah,
part of
yeah, it's supposed to be
the
uncomfortable.
experience. Yeah.
Hurt,
Both with
uncomfortable.
like right, I know. And some of these words are also kind of open to interpretation and like a little
Yeah, and
vague, but yeah.
it's that's tricky when someone is new to any physical practice, but because the one that I coach people through is strength training, like differentiating between, oh, that's the way it's supposed to hurt. Oh, I'm
Mhm.
supposed to be sore, versus, oh, that it's not supposed to hurt like that. That's unproductive soreness or joint soreness.
Mhm.
Like, people tend newer people tend to be a little bit more fearful or more apprehensive, and you have to help them
Right, like
understand that
coax
that's
them
okay.
like it's
It's supposed to
okay.
feel that way. That's normal. That's good. And then there are other people who are just like, oh, I'm gonna old school, no pain no gain, I'm just
That's
gonna push
right.
through it. And then those are like the like people we talked about earlier, where they're
The
maybe,
endurance copers versus
yeah.
the avoiders. It's kind of like that, a similar spectrum,
Yeah, I
but
would
in a
say.
training context versus a rehab context.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Travis, I think there's a really cool study that we wanted to touch on about elite endurance athletes. It's actually about long distance runners and sprinters. And it's really cool and super pertinent for this conversation because it specifically took these athletes and it looked at their interoception, which is kind of what this whole conversation has been about. And it was super interesting because it basically compared these like elite athletes, and then it also had people who are not athletes, and it tested. This goes back to what we talked about in the beginning, the different components of interoception and how you've got your interoceptive sensibility, which is your subjective sense of like how good your interoception is, and then your accuracy, like how accurate you actually are. And
Hmm.
just I'll just like in a very simplified summarization, and this study is from earlier this year. It's from 2023. So it's
Hot
really
off the
recent.
press.
Exactly. But the title is, I'll just read that. Interoceptive Differences in Elite Sprint and Long Distance Runners, a Multidimensional Investigation. Seabury et al. 2023. And what it found was that elite athletes, they thought they had higher confidence in their interoception. So they had higher interoceptive sensibility. They thought that they were better at interoception, but they were
Hmm.
actually worse than non athletes on an accuracy level. They were worse. They
Yeah.
sense their body less well, like on an accuracy level, than non-athletes. That's the basic gist.
Mm,
It's a little more complicated than that, and anyone can look up the
sure.
study to read it. But
We'll
um,
link it in the show notes.
yeah, we'll link it in the show notes. It's a super similar observation to the research that's been done on like meditation practices and
Hmm.
mindfulness practices, which is that like the meditation and mindfulness practices increase people's ability to feel like they know their body, but they don't
Hmm.
actually increase or are not correlated with the ability to feel it better accurately. And it's kind of the same with the elite athletes.
Yeah. And it's particularly interesting because, well, they're runners. Some of them are sprinters and some of them are distance. And you're saying that it was sort of the same. Like
Hmm.
you could imagine that for the distance runners, their training is teaching them to ignore their
Yes, that's
body.
right.
And I don't I wonder if that's kind of true for sprinters too. It's a little different because it
It's a
just
little
doesn't
different.
doesn't hurt the same way when you're sprinting versus when you're running
Right?
distance.
It's like a different
Yeah.
experience,
So
right?
it's like this we you don't want to necessarily extrapolate this to all athletes, but we do have runners at two ends of
Mhm.
the specialization spectrum with sprinters and distance.
That's
So
right.
we can say this for runners. I don't know if there's other research on athletes.
Right, right, and I don't know about yeah, I think there has been some, and actually this study, like in the introduction, talks about some previous research, and it basically was suggesting that the previous research indicated and suggested what this study also suggested, which is that, like,
Okay.
elite athletes are maybe kind of, characterized by a reduced ability to sense their body.
Wow.
So it's here's just an interesting quote. It is plausible that athletes who are particularly sensitive to internal sensation may struggle to push beyond their physiological boundaries as required in elite athletes. Meaning,
Yeah.
if they can sense their body better, maybe that makes it harder for them to push beyond
Yeah,
their
it self
limits.
selects out that they're not going to be in that study because they're not elite. They
Yeah,
can't get to that status because they can't push because they're more aware.
because they're more aware, which could
Wow.
hold them back in that type of setting.
Fascinating.
I think so too. So anyone who's interested should definitely look that study up. Because yeah, but I just think it's interesting because it kind of parallel. It's very different. I know, like elite athletes, very different setting than like a mindfulness practice.
Hmm.
But in both cases, they do seem to suggest that these mindfulness practitioners and elite athletes do have heightened confidence in their ability to feel their body. They think they feel their body better, but they actually don't.
Hmm.
And with the lead athletes, they actually felt their body less accurately than non. But from my memory with the mindfulness practitioners, they were just no different from non-mind.
Okay.
It wasn't that they were worse. It was just no
Gotcha.
different. That's my best memory of it. But anyway, I think that just kind of helps contribute to just this whole picture of maybe it's a complex question of whether we should always listen to our bodies, right?
I think we've demonstrated that. Yeah, I do.
And it's just kind of fascinating. Like, just I think the whole topic of interoception and also just taking a look at research. Like, I think sometimes there's a perception that I understand that research can be dry or boring, but I think actually it can, to the extent that it can help inform us about all these processes within the body, it can be fascinating, right?
Look how fun it is.
And important and just help
Yeah.
inform us. And but yeah, no, totally fun. I wasn't trying to say that it wasn't fun. It's super
Yeah. Yeah.
fun. But also just I think helps make us just, I don't know, better, more informed, whether it's that we're yoga movement teachers or just practitioners, or if we're fitness professionals, or even if we're rehab professionals listening to this. It's like I think all of that just really helps inform how we think about our body, our students, our clients' bodies, movement, pain, just the interface between all of that.
Hmm.
There's, like, so much there. So Travis, do you have any last thoughts to add, or do you think? we've kind of covered this.
We did it.
I think so too. I think we
To
covered.
to
Yeah.
to be continued, perhaps, in future discussions.
That's a great point. I do think these themes are like always kind of with us, always like underline so much of what we do. And definitely tune back into episode 24, in which that was all about interoception and emotions, specifically in pain. And it was a rad discussion too. But I think all of this is so good for us to talk about together and also for our audience to learn about. So thank you so much, Travis, for talking with me about this.
Thank you, Jenni.